There's a kind of refusal that rarely stops at the object being refused. When someone claims they don't wear materials made from animals, leather, wool, silk, the explanation laid out is usually moral, ethical, compassionate. But Machiavelli? He'd never settle for the surface level. He'd ask, what is this refusal organizing internally? Because, in the logic of human power, what you publicly reject almost always reveals just as much as what you choose. Not wearing animal products isn't just an aesthetic or ethical call, it's a symbolic stance. It's a way of telling the world, and yourself, I'm not part of this. That phrase, even if never spoken out loud, structures identity, belonging, and moral hierarchy. Machiavelli would quickly figure out that moral refusals are just as communicative as declared choices, and often, a hell of a lot more effective. In a society where direct conflict has taken a back seat, morality has turned into a silent battlefield. Skipping the leather or wool stops being just about caring for animals and starts functioning as a marker of higher consciousness. You differentiate yourself without needing a confrontation. You don't impose through force, but through virtue. This type of power is discreet, but deep. It doesn't need to attack to generate a comparison. The comparison happens on its own. From a psych standpoint, this refusal meets an ancient need, symbolic separation. The individual wants to distance themselves from whatever they associate with violence, exploitation, or brutality. By scrubbing these elements from their own body, they create a narrative of purity. I'm not carrying this baggage. Machiavelli would see this not as naivety, but as identity strategy. The body transforms into a walking moral manifesto. There's also a control element here. In a world that feels chaotic, unjust, and excessively violent, choosing what to wear becomes an accessible way to govern something. You might not control entire systems, but you control your own body. That sense of control brings psychological relief. The refusal acts as an anchor in the middle of perceived moral disorder. Another big point is belonging. Folks who refuse animal origin clothing rarely do it in isolation. They recognize each other in groups, discourses, communities. They share language, symbols, and values. This creates cohesion, and cohesion generates emotional security. Machiavelli would read this as the formation of a symbolic faction, not political but identitarian. The outfit stops being physical protection and becomes an entry password. But every faction needs contrast to exist. Whoever wears leather starts representing something to be rejected. You don't need to accuse them directly. The judgment is implicit. The simple refusal already establishes a silent moral hierarchy. I chose not to participate. Oh. Machiavelli would know that this type of hierarchy is powerful specifically because it isn't declared. It operates in the field of conscience, not force. Psychologically, this generates a constant kickback. Every choice reinforces the identity. Every refusal confirms the internal narrative of coherence and ethical superiority. The individual feels aligned with their values, and alignment reduces anxiety. The problem pops up when the choice stops being practical and becomes central to the ego. From then on, any questioning feels like a personal threat. Another aspect that barely gets discussed is the externalization of aggression. Instead of expressing it directly, it gets channeled into morality. You don't attack. You correct. You don't impose, you constrain. The other person feels the weight of the judgment without it ever being verbalized. Machiavelli would recognize this as a refined form of domination, exercising power without assuming the role of the dominator. There's also the dimension of symbolic purification. Not wearing animal materials creates the sensation of being morally clean. The body becomes neutral territory, separated from the suffering of others. This logic is emotionally potent, but psychologically dangerous. It tends to simplify the world into rigid categories: pure and impure, conscious and unconscious, correct and complicit. Machiavelli knew that minds operating like this lose nuance, and nuance is power. It's important to note that, at this early stage, the refusal isn't just about animals anymore. It's become a language. It communicates values, creates boundaries, and organizes relationships. The person starts defining themselves more by what they don't use than by what they build. Identity forms through opposition, and identities based on opposition require constant vigilance because they need to reaffirm the contrast 24/7. Machiavelli wouldn't condemn this choice. He'd observe it coldly. He'd say the risk isn't in avoiding certain materials, but in turning the refusal into the central pillar of your identity. When that happens, the choice stops serving the individual and starts governing them. The body turns into a flag. Morality turns into armor. And any armor, no matter how noble it looks, gets heavy when you wear it all the time. This is the starting point few admit. Moral refusals are rarely neutral. They structure the self, organize the world, and distribute symbolic power. And for Machiavelli, understanding this dynamic was always more important than accepting apparent virtue without question. For Machiavelli, no widely displayed refusal stays just in the realm of personal ethics. It transforms into a position, and a position, when sustained consistently, creates predictable psychological effects. People who refuse to wear animal products for moral reasons eventually start operating within a logic of symbolic distinction that goes way beyond the wardrobe. The fabric stops being material. It becomes language. The first noticeable move is the reconfiguration of value. What was once just functional, a coat, a shoe, an accessory, starts carrying moral weight. Clothing stops serving the body and starts serving the narrative. This alters how the individual perceives themselves and how they expect to be perceived. Getting dressed becomes an act of continuous affirmation. I am someone who doesn't compromise. Machiavelli would understand this as transforming the daily grind into a stage for positioning. Psychologically, this transformation offers a powerful sense of internal coherence. In a world perceived as ethically messy, the individual creates a fixed point, something non-negotiable. This fixity reduces anxiety because it eliminates ambiguity. But Machiavelli knew that any excessive reduction of ambiguity comes with a price tag, the loss of flexibility. When a choice turns into dogma, it stops responding to reality and starts demanding that reality bow to it. Another central element is moral visibility. Unlike internal beliefs, refusing certain materials is noticeable. It can be seen, commented on, recognized. This creates a subtle social payoff. Approving nods, positive comments, that feeling of aligning with the conscious crowd. The brain registers this as validation, and repeated validation strengthens the behavior, even when it starts losing practical utility. Machiavelli would observe that at this point the choice isn't just ethical anymore, it's strategic. It positions the individual in certain social circles and distances them from others. This doesn't happen through direct force, but through moral affinity. Invitations change, environments adjust. The person starts circulating where their identity is reinforced. This narrowing of context generates comfort, but it also limits exposure to different perspectives. There's also the formation of a distinct moral language. Terms like cruelty, anti-exploitation, and consciousness start getting used in a loaded way, not just to describe facts, but to classify people. Whoever wears certain materials isn't just someone with a different preference, they become someone who doesn't care. This simplification isn't necessarily conscious, but it's functional. It organizes the world into clear camps. Machiavelli would understand this as a tool for cognitive control. Another important aspect is the transfer of conflict. Instead of dealing with more complex internal tensions, impotence in the face of major injustices, frustration with unreachable systems, the individual finds a field where they can act with immediate impact. Refusing to wear something generates a sense of concrete action. The moral conflict is shifted to controllable territory. This alleviates the feeling of passivity, but it can also create an illusion of greater efficacy than what's real. Over time, this dynamic produces rigidity. External questions start being interpreted as attacks. Simple questions are seen as provocations. The body reacts with defensiveness. The conversation loses nuance. Machiavelli would say that when a position can't tolerate questioning, it has ceased to be strength and has become protected fragility. Then there's the component of performative coherence. Once the moral identity is on display, the individual feels the need to keep it spotless. Every choice starts being monitored. Every exception needs an explanation. The psychological cost of this is high. The mind enters a mode of continuous surveillance. The body feels this surveillance as constant tension. The lightness disappears. Machiavelli would grasp that this surveillance isn't a sign of elevated virtue, but of identity dependence. The person isn't acting out of calm choice anymore, but out of symbolic obligation. The refusal, which started as a conscious decision, starts demanding absolute fidelity. The clothes govern the individual, not the other way around. At this stage, the apparel isn't about animals. It's about belonging, moral status, and symbolic control. The person feels they need to keep refusing to keep being who they believe they are. And Machiavelli would be clear in his observation. When an identity needs to be reaffirmed every day through visible acts, it isn't secure. It's being propped up. This is the point where the refusal stops being an isolated ethical gesture and becomes a psychological gear. A gear that organizes relationships and reduces specific internal conflicts, but creates deeper ones. And for Machiavelli, understanding this trade-off, what is gained and what is lost, was always more important than celebrating apparent virtue without examining its hidden cost. When this psychological gear stabilizes, it starts producing deeper, less visible effects. The refusal to wear animal products stops being just social identity and starts shaping the person's relationship with their own body, with pleasure, and with the real world. Machiavelli would watch this stage closely because this is where virtue starts charging a silent internal price. From a psych perspective, a subtle but decisive shift happens. The body stops being lived in and starts being managed. Getting dressed is no longer a spontaneous gesture but a moral calculation. Every choice has to pass the test of ideological coherence. The body stops being a space for experience and transforms into an ethical display case. Machiavelli knew that when the body becomes a display case, it loses intimacy with the person inhabiting it. This constant vigilance creates a state of internal containment. The person moves, chooses, and presents themselves with excessive care. Not out of vanity, but out of fear of incoherence. The nervous system responds to this containment with tension, light but persistent. It's not acute anxiety, it's rigidity. A stiffness that accumulates over time and manifests as emotional fatigue, difficulty relaxing, and a diffuse feeling of always being on duty. Psychology recognizes this pattern as hyper-identification. When a moral choice becomes too central, it starts absorbing psychic energy that could be used for other areas of life. The individual thinks more about their image than they perceive. They observe more than they feel. They control more than they experience. Machiavelli would see this as a waste of internal resources. Energy used to maintain appearances is energy that stops strengthening your real position. Another major effect is the suspicion regarding pleasure. Materials associated with comfort, durability, or sex appeal start carrying negative symbolic weight. Pleasure becomes something that needs to be justified. This creates an ambiguous relationship with one's own well-being. The person takes pride in the renunciation but pays for it with sensory impoverishment. The body misses variety, texture, warmth, not just physical, but symbolic. Machiavelli would spot a classic strategic error here: confusing sacrifice with elevation. Sacrifice only strengthens you when it's chosen freely, and abandoned when it stops serving you. When it becomes permanent and identitarian, it hardens. The individual begins to define themselves more by what they deny than by what they build. Life starts getting organized around avoidance, not creation. There's also a shift in the perception of others. People who don't share the same refusal start being viewed with moral mistrust. Even if it's not verbalized, the body reacts. The eyes evaluate. The mind classifies. This creates micro-distances in relationships. Spontaneity shrinks. Empathy becomes conditional on agreement. Machiavelli knew this weakens alliances. Relationships based on symbolic purity tend to be fragile in the face of human complexity. Another point rarely discussed is the anxiety of future coherence. As the identity crystallizes, the fear of failure creates a shadow. What if one day I need to make an exception? What if I change my mind? These questions aren't asked out loud, but they operate in the back of the mind. The individual feels they don't have permission to evolve without betraying themselves. That feeling is a prison. The body responds with anticipatory tension. Freedom diminishes. Machiavelli would understand that this is the price of turning decisions into dogmas. Dogma demands absolute loyalty. Any nuance becomes a threat. The person starts protecting the identity more fiercely than they protect their own well-being. This doesn't happen out of malice, but out of fear of symbolic collapse. Who am I if I stop being this? At the deepest level, this dynamic creates a separation between the real self and the idealized moral self. The real self feels desires, exhaustion, curiosity. The ideal self demands consistency, purity, firmness. The conflict between these two selves generates silent wear and tear. Machiavelli knew that silent conflicts are the most dangerous because they find no release. They corrode from the inside. This is the point where the refusal stops being just ethical and becomes psychological. It organizes the inner world, but it also restricts it. The person feels like they're in control, but actually they're responding to a structure they helped create. And Machiavelli would be clear: when a structure starts governing the individual more than the individual governs it, it doesn't matter how noble it looks, it has become a limit. It is at this stage that virtue begins to harden, and anything that hardens too much sooner or later loses the capacity to adapt. For Machiavelli, this isn't a moral problem, it's a strategic problem. When this hardening drags on, the moral refusal starts influencing not just the individual, but how they position themselves in the world. Machiavelli would observe that from this point on, the choice stops being personal and starts having strategic consequences. Not because it's wrong in essence, but because it's been elevated to a level where it starts limiting one's own ability to act with social intelligence. One of the first effects is the reduction of maneuvering room. People who define themselves strongly by the refusal of animal origin clothing begin to move in increasingly predictable spaces. Environments, events, and relationships start getting filtered by moral compatibility. This creates a sense of safety, but also of narrowing. Machiavelli knew that whoever shrinks their territory too much loses influence, even while maintaining internal coherence. In professional and social relationships, this rigidity can generate subtle friction, not explicit but perceptible. The individual starts carrying an aura of implicit judgment. Even without intention, their presence communicates a moral stance. Others feel the need to justify themselves, adapt, or avoid certain topics. This vibe kills spontaneity. The conversation becomes calculated. Machiavelli would understand this as a loss of relational capital. People who are excessively predictable morally tend to be sought out less for complex alliances. There is also the effect of permanent self-expectation. The stronger the moral identity gets, the more the individual feels they need to represent it perfectly. Small slip-ups gain disproportionate weight. A questionable accessory, a gift received, an ambiguous situation. Everything becomes a test. The body reacts to this vigilance with constant tension. The mind anticipates the judgment, external or internal. Rest becomes incomplete. Machiavelli knew that real power requires energy economy. Whoever spends energy defending an image has less energy to build a position. Moral refusal, when transformed into armor, is heavy. It protects, but it also tires you out. The individual becomes the guardian of their own coherence, not the architect of their own expansion. Another cost shows up in the relationship with time. Rigid identities tend to freeze. The person keeps being the one who doesn't use X, while the world changes around them. What started as a current stance can become a mark of the past. When this happens, a silent discomfort arises, the feeling of defending something that no longer grows with your life. Machiavelli would warn that effective strategies need to move with time, not against it. There is also an important emotional consequence: moral resentment. When the individual feels they are doing the right thing and yet doesn't receive recognition, understanding, or influence, frustration sets in. This frustration is rarely admitted. It's repressed and transformed into a silent critique of the world. People don't care. Society is insensitive. Machiavelli would understand this as a sign of poorly calibrated expectations. Displayed virtue usually expects a return. At the deepest psychological level, this stage reveals a dangerous inversion. The person starts measuring their value by their fidelity to the refusal, not by the quality of their own life. Being right becomes more important than being whole. The body feels this inversion as a loss of vitality. The mind feels it as stiffness. The world starts being seen as something to be corrected, not lived. Machiavelli wouldn't condemn this path, but he'd issue a clear warning. When a moral refusal becomes the central axis of identity, it stops being a tool and becomes an absolute filter. Everything passes through it: decisions, relationships, emotions. The individual loses nuance, and losing nuance is losing strategic advantage. At this point, the refusal doesn't just serve to protect animals or affirm values. It organizes the ego. And when the ego is organized around a negation, it needs to deny constantly to sustain itself. This creates a cycle of continuous defense. Defense is tiring. Defense hardens. Defense limits. Machiavelli would summarize this stage simply: any position that doesn't allow for movement transforms into an obstacle. It doesn't matter how noble its origin was. When identity demands constant vigilance to avoid collapsing, it has already ceased to be a spontaneous force and has become a heavy structure. And heavy structures, even when they look solid, reduce the capacity for adaptation. For Machiavelli, this reduction is always a risk, because the world doesn't reward those who remain pure. It rewards those who remain lucid. Machiavelli would wrap up this analysis by shifting the focus from the refusal to something more fundamental. Who is in command of this choice? Because for him, the question was never about the fabric of the clothes, but about internal sovereignty. Not wearing animal origin clothes can be a conscious, ethical, and legitimate gesture, or it can be a structure that silently governs the one who adopted it. The difference between one and the other lies in the degree of freedom that still remains. The first move of repositioning is to pull the refusal out of the center of identity. When a practice stops being used to define who the person is, it regains lightness. The choice continues to exist, but it no longer demands constant defense or continuous vigilance. Machiavelli would say that what truly belongs to someone doesn't need to be protected all the time. Only what is fragile requires permanent armor. From a psych standpoint, this means abandoning the need for symbolic purity. Purity is a static ideal. Life is dynamic. When the individual accepts that they can sustain values without turning them into a character test, something relaxes deeply. The body comes out of the state of containment. The mind stops calculating every gesture. The choice goes back to serving the person, not the ego. Machiavelli would also advise a clear distinction between conviction and exhibition. Real convictions don't need to be seen. They guide decisions silently. When morality stops being a language of power, it loses rigidity and gains efficiency. The person doesn't need to convert, correct, or constrain. They simply act according to their criteria and observe the world with more breadth. Another essential point is recovering the relationship with complexity. The world doesn't organize itself into clean moral lines. Systems are contradictory. People are incoherent. Materials carry ambiguous histories. Accepting this doesn't weaken values, it strengthens intelligence. Machiavelli knew that those who tolerate ambiguity govern better than those who need to reduce everything to right and wrong just to feel safe. On the level of the body, this change is evident. Getting dressed stops being a ritual of moral validation and goes back to being a dialogue with the context, the weather, the function, the pleasure. The body recovers sensitivity. Aesthetics stop being proof and go back to being expression. This doesn't imply abandoning ethical choices, but liberating them from excessive weight. The organism responds with more vitality, more presence, more flow. There's also an important transformation in relationships. When the refusal stops being a flag, the judgment loses force. People feel less need to justify themselves. The conversation opens up. Listening deepens. Machiavelli would understand this as a strategic gain. Less friction, more real influence. The most effective power isn't the kind that constrains, but the kind that doesn't need to impose itself. This repositioning also gives back something precious: the right to change. When identity isn't tied to the refusal, the individual can adjust, revise, and evolve without feeling like they're betraying themselves. The choice stops being a sentence and goes back to being a decision. This reduces future anxiety. The fear of incoherence disappears. Freedom increases. Machiavelli would summarize this closing with brutal clarity. Virtue that requires constant rigidity isn't virtue. It's a defense mechanism. True strength lies in sustaining values without turning your own life into a tribunal. Whoever governs their choices doesn't need to turn them into a spectacle. They just move forward, adjusting when necessary, without asking for permission or seeking absolution. In the end, it was never about leather, wool, or silk. It was about control. About who decides, the individual or the identity they built to protect themselves from the world. While the refusal rules, the person lives in vigilance. When the person rules the refusal, they live with strategy. And Machiavelli would leave a final silent warning. Everything that starts as moral liberation can become a symbolic prison if it isn't kept under conscious command. Real power isn't in denying the world, but in moving within it without being governed by the fear of seeming incoherent. Whoever understands this doesn't need to prove they're on the right side, they just act.